And John, thank you to you, Director Cox, and the work you did in Wyoming. I guess it's about a year ago, and we're able to increase the user fee. I heard that Iowa just did the same thing just yesterday, and it goes into effect on Monday. So that's fast work. So, it's good to hear that the states, which have always moved much faster than the federal government, are solving their problems. Also, I'm happy to have a meeting today for the first time with our new secretary of PennDOT, Secretary Richards. Thank you. We had a good crowd in there this morning, 13 of the 18 members, because I think that everybody in this room probably hears from their members of Congress, their delegations, when something's not going right. Well, we appreciate the work you do, and that's today I wanted to make sure Secretary knew all their faces, so when they start calling, she knows what they look like. But no, it's a great honor to be here today, and to be here, Secretary Mineta. There he is. Secretary Mineta is his chairman, Ice-T, I believe it was, 1991. He formed a great bipartisan partnership with the other Shuster. The other Shuster would say he's the original Shuster, and still the only chairman in the Shuster family. But no, it's great that Secretary Mineta is here, and I know the hard work that they put in together, and we're able to move significant legislation to move the infrastructure in this country forward. So, Secretary, it's always a pleasure to be here. And he was a customer of mine also. He bought a convertible from me. So, and I assure you, I didn't make any money on it, or very little. But it's great to see you, Mr. Secretary. And again, being here today in a room filled with transportation enthusiasts, transportation junkies. This is really important room for me to be in to talk to you about my view on moving forward, on my view of the role of the federal government. And that's where I want to start first. I think it's important when you're up on the Hill talking to members of Congress, talking about the founding of this country, and that it was really a transportation issue. It was the breaking point that they threw the Articles of Confederation out because they weren't working. And it was a transportation issue where Maryland and Virginia couldn't come together on a treaty to go up the Potomac to get to western Pennsylvania, the Ohio Territory. And so when they drew the Constitution up, Article 1, Section 8 is pretty clear, talking about common defense, interstate commerce, and establishing post roads. So there is, and there has been always, a federal role when it comes to building the infrastructure in this country. A couple years ago, when we were trying to move MAP 21, I was asked to go in and make the pitch to some of our folks that are extremely conservative. And so I was making that pitch, and I also came up with a quote from The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, that many on my side, that's the Bible for when it comes to the free markets, free economies, the capitalism system. And Adam Smith said very, very clearly in my edition of Wealth of Nations on page 393, if anybody wants to check it, he clearly said that the government should do three things for the people: provide them with security, preserve justice, and erect and maintain infrastructure to promote commerce. So it couldn't be any clearer to me. Adam Smith said it, the Founding Father said it, and for the last 230 years, the federal government has had a role. And that brings us to Congress. And as we move forward on the T&I committee, we have a lot of work to do. We're going to have a very, very busy year. And I learned a lot by passing the Water Resources Reform and Development Act last year. And as I stood up at one point in the conference, and I'm making the pitch to my colleagues in the Republican conference, it kind of dawned on me that, and I said it out loud, this is not my father's Congress. I don't have earmarks. I don't have some of the tools to be able to get people to come on board. So we figured out a way to do it differently, and one of the keys to that was to bring the stakeholders in, folks like you, and people that care about the transportation system, getting their views, their ideas, but then more importantly, going out there and helping me and helping my colleagues on the committee to convince other members, to educate other members on the importance of moving a water resources bill. And we were able to do that successfully. So we learned a tremendous amount going through that process, how to bring people together, how to make the pitch to them, how to get them on board. And we have a big agenda in this Congress for the Transportation Committee. Our two biggest pieces of legislation will be the Surface Transportation Bill, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But we're also, another large piece of legislation that we need to move this year is an FAA reauthorization bill, which I'll talk a little bit about. But other things that that are on the agenda is we're going to move a passenger rail bill, we think next week, moved out of committee on a voice vote, so it's very bipartisan. It'll be on the floor next week as long as we figure out what we're going to do with DHS and we were able to move forward on that issue. That should be on the floor next week, and it has a lot of positive reforms in it for Amtrak and trying to move Amtrak to operate more like a business and to those folks on the Northeast Corridor who really care about Amtrak and are willing, the state's willing to make investments, put those kinds of reforms in there to help move that along. Again, we want to move another WRDA bill. A pipeline safety bill is going to be on the agenda. Emergency management reform bill, which I know is important to the states, and a GSA reform bill. And the final issue, and we're trying to figure out how to get it right, this issue on WOTUS, Waters of the United States, which I know something like 30 states have rejected it. I believe if this moves forward in the way the administration wants it to move forward, it's going to be very, very bad for the economy, especially when you talk about agriculture and people that build things, and it'll slow things down and just cost us more money. So we're working through that process. But the surface transportation bill expires at the end of May, and we are working very hard on trying to come up with a solution on the funding. Paul Ryan, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, is committed, as our leadership is committed, to finding a long-term solution to get a bill, not the long-term solution that will carry us into the next couple of decades, but we need to figure out how to do a long-term bill and get the funding. And there's a lot of ideas out there, but again, it's in the Ways and Means jurisdiction, but we're dealing with and working with them every day, trying to get them a number, trying to push the number up. They may push down, but we're working it. And I can tell you this, I'm confident we are going to get a long-term bill because on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the Capitol and both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, everybody wants a long-term bill in Washington. So the funding is going to be the challenge to get a long-term bill. It needs to be fiscally responsible. We will not be able to pass a transportation bill in this Congress that isn't fiscally responsible, isn't paid for. And I think there are solutions out there. We're also going to make sure that we try to get Washington out of your way so that you can do these projects quicker, faster, and less expensive. We did a lot of good work in MAP 21. Some of that has not been implemented, so we're watching very closely, but there's still more we can do there to encourage, again, you folks to move as fast as you can and get the federal government out of your way. I think it's going to be important for us to have in there a title on intelligent transportation, because I know that the roads we build in the next 5 and 10 years, they're going to have cars on them that literally drive themselves. Now, all we need to have in this bill to start the conversation about how do we build those roads. Are there materials we should be talking about? What should we be studying? Different configurations. So we need to, again, start that conversation. I know Pennsylvania contracted Carnegie Mellon, who won the contest for the first driverless vehicle. They contracted with Carnegie Mellon to already start that process of studying, what's a road need to look like? What are the materials? So I think that's critical to having a long-term bill so that we start talking about it and thinking about it as we move forward. Again, the focus needs to be back on the freight corridors in this country, to fund those important corridors that move product, that move people, and have that focus on there, because we all know that if they're not deteriorating, they're in need of expanded capacity. Because if you look at the freight that we're going to get into this country, you look at the population of this country over the next 20, 30 years, it's going to grow significantly. So we need to make sure we're focused on that. Stretching those federal dollars and accelerating projects, as I talked about, I think are critical so that those dollars are stretched farther. I spent some time in Oklahoma, and I know that Oklahoma director's here. I met with the secretary earlier this week, but I went out to it's the Oklahoma Crosstown Expressway. Did I get it right, Mike? And so I led a delegation out there, and we're standing on the old part that they're going to tear down because the new has been built, and they had a big picture of a congressional delegation that my father happened to lead 15 years earlier. And he stood there saying, we're going to get this done, we're going to help Oklahoma, but it took 15 years to build this roadway. And, it really hit me hard when I started to think about it. If we could have done that in half the time, just in inflation alone, and it was a $670 million project, give or take, if we just cut it in half, they could have saved 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 million dollars just in that one project alone. So if we're able to get these things accelerated, there's billions of dollars of savings out there, and so that's something we really need to focus on. As I said, it needs to be fiscally responsible, and we're working on that. There are some folks on Capitol Hill that talk about devolution, and I was talking to my counterpart, and I think he was in here earlier, Senator Jim Inhofe, about devolution on our first meeting, and he said, you know who wrote the first devolution bill? And I, of course, had no idea, and it was him, Jim Inhofe, when he was in the House. And I said, well, Jim, I haven't heard you talk about devolution. He said, I'm not for it anymore because I realized you can't do it. There is a federal role. And in many states, Wyoming, one of them, about 70% of their funds come from the federal government. And on average, over 50% come from the federal government. So there's a federal role, and devolution just won't work. And so again, it's great to have a partner like Jim Inhofe. And I have to tell you also, I was out at Oklahoma, and I was standing before a crowd, and this was right before the election, and I said, Jim, I dream about you almost every night. And he looked at me, and I realized, well, that kind of sounded bad. And I said, I'm dreaming about you being the chairman of EPW in the Senate so that we can move forward a bill that we're talking about. So again, I have a great partner in Jim Inhofe, and again, I think we're going to be able to get a lot of things done, reforms done, and move a bill. The second bill that I mentioned, the FAA reauthorization, I believe that if we don't do something significantly different in the way we manage the airspace above us, the traffic control of the airspace, we are going to continue to lose market share for our airlines. And if we don't reform the way they regulate and certify our manufacturers, we're going to continue to see a decline in our leadership in the world. And aviation is one of those industries we invented. We invented aviation, and when you look back through the history of America and you look at textiles or automobiles or electronics, you name the industry, we've lost the lead. And it's because of our government getting in the way. So we've got to figure out a way to transform the FAA so that they are out of the way of the aviation industry, the airline industry, so that they can go out there and compete and grow their market share and grow their leadership and not lose it. I believe we have an opportunity to do something transformational at FAA. It's been tried a couple of times before, but the stars just weren't quite lined up. And when you look at the different stakeholders out there, of course, the airlines, they desperately want to see next gen so they can be more efficient, they get more passengers moved efficiently and do good things with using less fuel, good for the environment. Our manufacturers want to see something different so that they can build products faster and deploy this technology to add to planes to make them safer. But you also have something that's occurred over the last 4 or 5 years with the air traffic controllers, NATCA, the folks that actually do the work. After 23 extensions on the last FAA bill, after sequestration and a government shutdown, they've had it because FAA always takes the brunt of a situation like that. So we're sitting down with those folks, and we're looking around the world. And if you look around the world, there are about 50 countries that have taken and commercialized or public-private partnership or moved the air traffic controller system out of the government. And on every place you look, they're as safe or safer than the United States, especially when you look at the developing countries, Canada, Britain, Germany, Australia. So we were looking around the world to try to find a way to do this better and more efficiently, but obviously maintaining the safety that's required of the American people and, of course, of the industry. And I believe we have an opportunity to do that. Secretary Fox, I know he spoke to you, I guess, yesterday or earlier today. He and I have been talking and working on that. I think there's common ground there, as well as on a surface transportation bill. I mentioned to you PREA, came out of the committee in a bipartisan vote. Lots of good reforms in there, making sure that states that want to invest their dollars, that we're making sure in this that the PennDOT's holding up their end of the bargain. Pennsylvania, a great example, under the Rendell administration, put $100 million into the Keystone line, which runs from Harrisburg, our state capital, to Philadelphia. Amtrak put $100 million. They reduced the travel time by about 20 minutes. Ridership's up 85% over the last several years. And I'm a postcard. I should be the poster board child for Amtrak, because I remember when my father years ago was trying to fix it. I'm this young 20-some-year-old and saying, there is no way I'm ever getting out of my car to ride a railroad because I want the freedom. And yet here today, because of the Keystone line with Pennsylvania, what we do here from Washington to Philadelphia, I never get in my car to drive to Philadelphia or New York, because it's just so much more convenient and efficient. So again, you look at Pennsylvania and what they've done. We need to look around the country and figure out how we can engage the states, making sure Amtrak is holding up its end of the bargain and making those investments so that we have intercity passenger rail in places. And there's places like the Northeast Corridor that absolutely need it. There's other places around the country, the West Coast and some of our our population hubs in other parts of the country that need passenger rail. So making sure that we're doing our part, pushing Amtrak to become more businesslike, more efficient, and making sure that, as I said, they're holding up at their end of the bargain as they move passengers around this country. As I said, we have a big agenda for the committee this year, and what my ask of you is, as you've always done, is to help us move the bill, talking to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. On my side of the aisle, there are some that think, oh, we spend too much already. But I think everybody in this room knows there needs to be a significant more investment into our infrastructure. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, when they see a new pot of money, they want to come up with 6 or 7 new programs. And we've really got to focus what we spend these dollars on back, as I said in the beginning of my speech, into these corridors, into the critical infrastructure, into rebuilding our bridges, and adding capacity where we need it around the country. So again, I ask for your help as we move forward. I can't move a piece of legislation unless I have the stakeholders really out there banging the drum and convincing and, as I said, educating members of Congress to the importance of investing in infrastructure. So again, thank all of you for being here in Washington. I look forward to working with you. You know, Bud does a fantastic job for your group here in Washington. He made a great hire in Jim Timon. I was a little upset when Jim left, but only for about a second, because Jim is still somebody we rely on, listen to, and get his advice as we move forward. So again, your organization's great here in Washington, and I know what you do is fantastic across the United States. So thank you very much for having me here today, and have a great meeting. Thank you.